Am I prepared to film this? No. Is it happening anyway? Absolutely. Hey guys, it's Casey, and today we're going to talk about the books I read in September. So in the month of September, I managed to read 9 books. 3 of them were 3-star books, 4 of them were 4-star books, and 3 of them were 5-star books. So checking back in briefly with my TBR that I set for myself in September, I completed most everything. I completed everything that I said I had to read that month, and most of the things that I said I wanted to read. I think the only thing I didn't read was A Closed and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers because I ran out of time, but that's still 9 books to talk about, and I don't want this wrap up to be quite as long as last time, so let's get started. So the first thing I read this month, surprising no one, was Proven Guilty by Jim Butcher, which is the 8th book to the Dresden Files. So I've been basically starting off my months reading 1 or 2 Dresden Files books every month since June, and this is the 8th one. So broadly speaking, if you haven't heard me talk about it before, the Dresden Files follows Wizard for Hire Harry Dresden as he works with the Chicago PD and as a private investigator to solve all manner of crimes that were perpetrated by supernatural beings or have some kind of magical component to them. And I've really been enjoying this series, and it's kind of picked up ever since basically book 4 pretty consistently. I gave Proven Guilty 4 stars. It's the least I've liked one of the Dresden Files books since I think the 5th one. I was not a huge fan of this one. Well, okay, let me rephrase. I really liked a lot of this book. There was one major aspect in it that I really kind of felt icky about, like I wasn't a big fan of it, but other than that one piece, I would give it 5 stars. But because that piece was there, I feel like I can't really give the book 5 stars. I don't even feel comfortable giving it 4.5. I'm just gonna give it a straight 5. If you read it, you probably know what I'm talking about. But it gets kind of resolved. I don't know. It just made me feel icky, so I just went ahead and gave it a 4. So then a little bit later in the month, but I'm gonna go ahead and group it here, I read White Knight by Jim Butcher, which is the 9th book to the Dresden Files, and this one I gave 5 stars. This is the first Dresden Files book that I have given a full 5 stars to. I loved this one. There was a good amount of action to really kind of keep it going. There was a lot of really fun character development. There was a lot of screen time and wonderful moments with some of my favorite people, so I loved that. I also felt like we got a lot of insight into what some of the broader overarching plot is starting to become, and I really loved that. I just thought this was probably one of my favorite entries. I still think Blood Rights, the 6th book, is my personal favorite, but I feel like objectively this is the most solid one out of all of them so far. Loved it. So excited for the rest of them. Okay, so between those two, I actually read Educated by Tara Westover, which was my non-fiction book for the month. So Educated is a memoir by Tara Westover about her experiences growing up in a family that did not allow her to become formally educated, and that kind of prepped her for almost like a doomsday sort of a situation. It was kind of a religious cult that was gone way too far. It shows her journey growing up in that environment and some of the abuse that she suffered during that time, and it shows her journey to become formally educated and kind of move past a lot of the trauma that happened in her childhood. I gave this one 4 stars. I really liked it. It was very emotional and difficult to read at times, and I thought that her journey was very interesting and very inspiring, and I feel weird like rating memoirs because it feels like I'm putting a star rating on their life story, but just from like a writing perspective, I liked a lot of it. I only gave it 4 stars instead of 5 because there were a couple of pieces that I felt could have been expanded upon and I wanted to know more about. For example, she talks a lot about mental health and the mental health of her and some members of her family, but then doesn't address how that might have played a role for others. And there were just some things that I felt like I wanted more information on. I also wanted more information on how she related to religion and some of the things her family taught her now compared to what she did then. There were just like a couple of little details that I really felt were kind of missed opportunities to show some of that growth, but other than that, it's a really solid memoir. I listened to the audiobook. It was great. Highly recommend it. And next I read The Dragon Republic by R.F. Kuang. So I gave this one 4.5 stars. I really loved it though. I just didn't love it as much as I did the first book. I felt like the character development in this was great. I felt like the world building and the expansion of kind of that war plotline that we got in the first one and some of the fallout from that was very interesting and intriguing, but something about part of the I hesitate to say charm because it's such a ruthless and disturbing book, but some of what I liked about the first one wasn't as present in this one. This book was still, again, amazing, but I felt like I was missing some of that. Again, R.F. Kuang's writing style is incredible. She doesn't shy away from the gory and horrific details of war. Her message gets across loud and clear, her characters develop in really interesting ways, and I really liked that, but I felt like there was a large chunk of this fairly long book where we weren't accomplishing much, and I know that that kind of happened a little bit in the second half of the first one too, but I just felt like for some reason this one dragged on a little bit more and there wasn't quite as much interest propelling me forward. I really loved the last chunk of this book. The last chunk of this book was for sure 5 stars. It was just kind of the middle slowed down for me, but where we ended, I cannot wait for The Burning God to come out next month. I want to read it. I'm so ready. I love this series. If you haven't read this series, it's so good. You should read it. I feel like I am absolutely sprinting through these books, but that's gonna be fine. So the next thing I read last month was Every Heart a Doorway by Seanan McGuire. I gave this book 5 stars. That's 10. 5 stars. I loved it so much. I had read Middle Game by Seanan McGuire before, and one of the things I really praised about that book was the atmosphere and kind of its general vibe and tone I really enjoyed, and that shines through so strongly with Every Heart a Doorway. When I finished reading it, the thing that really struck me was the atmosphere, and there was just such a strong vibe basically to it. Like there was such a strong sense of tone, and there was this sense of whimsy, but also this very dark underlying themes, and I really loved it. The plot, like the mystery that goes on, was a little simple, but it's a novella, so I wasn't expecting huge amounts of intrigue. Parts of it still took me by surprise. I love Jack. I don't think that's an unpopular opinion, but I cannot stress it enough. I love Jack, and I love the world building that happened in this novella. For such a short book, I felt like I really got to know a lot about the different worlds that these kids came from. Oh my god, I never explained the plot. So this is a series of novellas about children who have been whisked away through magical doorways to magical worlds, and it deals with when they come back, kind of the psychological trauma that essentially causes, being ripped away from the world that was perfect for you and thrust back into our real world. And this one follows our main character Nancy as she comes back through her doorway to our world and is admitted by her parents into a school that they think is for like reforming kind of disturbed children, but it's really like a sanctuary home for other children who have gone through this kind of experience. And while she's there, some of the kids start to turn up dead, and it kind of follows this mystery. And I loved this. The mystery was fun. The atmosphere was so creepy and whimsical at the same time. I absolutely loved it. I think Seanan McGuire nailed exactly what she was trying to do with this book, and I am 100% going to read the rest of the series because I think the next one follows Jack and Jill, and in case I didn't say it loud enough earlier, I love Jack! Okay, so continuing the trend of second books in a fantasy series that I love but not quite as much as the first book, we have The Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson. So I also gave this one a 4.5 stars. So some of what I loved so much about The Final Empire, the first book in the Mistborn trilogy, was the heist aspect of it. It was the plotting, the camaraderie, the kind of conniving that went on. I really loved that. I always love that in my books, and I felt like some of that was missing here. It kind of played in more towards the like 50% mark, but I felt like a lot of this was developing Vin's character and her relationship with some other characters. And as much as I liked that, it felt a little repetitive sometimes. It was a little bit of me wanting to grab Vin by the shoulders and say, just talk to them. But other than that, I really did enjoy it. I felt like, again, I didn't love this one quite as much as the first one, but it was still a really solid book, and I loved the expansion of the world that we got and more information on what kind of led the world to become in the state that it is in. The way that things went, I had kind of a sense of what was going to happen, but in typical Sanderson style, the last like 15% of the book was just an absolute crash avalanche of plot twists and just high energy right up until the end of the book. And the end was amazing and I loved it, but I kind of suffered through some of the middle because there was less of that intrigue that I felt like I had the first time, and it was more just like focused on the relationships between the characters. And again, normally I love character-driven points in novels or character-driven books in general, but I felt like so much of what happened could have been resolved a little bit more expediently than it was, and I don't know, it dragged a little bit in the middle for me. But again, I loved this book and I cannot wait to see how this trilogy wraps up. Here's hoping we finish it in October. So the next thing I read was Ouran High School Host Club Volume 1 by Bisco Hattori. I love this series. I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars. Ultimately, this holds a special, wonderful, nostalgic place in my heart. It was one of the first anime that I ever watched, and I didn't even realize I owned this volume of the manga until I found it like in a box somewhere this summer, but I was so excited to read it, and it gave me all of those like warm, excited, nostalgic feelings that I got, kind of reminding me of when I watched it the first time. But like, from a critical standpoint, this is probably 3 stars. 3.5. 3.5. I really liked this. It is essentially a rom-com reverse harem anime that follows our main character Haruhi as she attends Ouran Academy. Ouran Academy is a very prestigious school that is usually attended by society's elite, and she is there on a scholarship. While looking for a quiet place to study one day, she walks into an old music room and accidentally encounters the host club, a group of boys that takes women out on dates. And while she's there and scrambling to get away from them, she accidentally knocks over a vase, and the leader of the host club, Tamaki, love of my life, says that Haruhi can pay off the debts to the club if she agrees to work as a host. At the time, Tamaki is mistaking her for a boy. Romantic comedy ensues. It's a fun time. All of these boys are ridiculous and precious and wonderful. This entire manga is so over the top. This volume was again setting up a lot of the story, and we kind of started to get into like the episodic hijinks a little bit later. Critically, again, I really like this. It's not a 5-star book. I have a lot of warm fuzzy feelings about it. Look at this nonsense. It knows what it's trying to be. And it was exactly what I needed when I read it. Oh, backwards. It was exactly what I needed when I read it. I was very glad that I did, but it felt weird giving it a 4-star because, like, again, critically, it was just a fun time. But if you haven't gotten into this series, I do recommend it. It's really fun. Next, I read one of my most anticipated books of the year, and it did not disappoint, and that is The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. It's so weird. It was so good though. I gave this book, I think I'm gonna settle on 5 stars. I was debating between 4.5 and 5 for a while, but I think this is my favorite N.K. Jemisin book that I've read. I really loved the Broken Earth trilogy, and I think I gave most of those 4 stars, and I think I gave the last one 5 stars, but I think I'm gonna go ahead and give this one 5 stars because this was such a strong start, and it was so different from everything else she's written. Everything else of hers that she's written that I've read, granted I haven't read the Dream Blood duology yet, has a very like fantastical way of looking at it. The Broken Earth trilogy has some like post-apocalyptic, arguably like science fantasy kind of vibes, but for the most part they do tend to be like fantasy. There's magic systems, there's gods, depending on the series, but this was so different than all of that. So The City We Became is about the birth of New York City. So in this world, our world, the world that N.K. Jemisin presents, cities, once they reach a certain population, like cultural distinctiveness, actually become alive. They manifest in like an avatar and are born. So this book follows the birth of the city of New York. And during the birthing process, there are some complications, and New York's avatar kind of has to go into hiding, almost like a hibernation. And each of the 5 boroughs manifests as a person as well. And so this book follows each of the 5 boroughs and their avatars as they kind of come together and then work to bring New York City back to the height it's supposed to be at. But along the way, they are fighting against who they call the Woman in White, who is essentially kind of, I've heard it described as basically a Karen. Like she manifests typically as a middle-aged white woman, and she is trying to bring about hatred and things that are very bigoted and basically the antithesis of the values of New York City. But also she is really kind of almost like an eldritch horror otherworldly being. She basically infects people with these little white tentacles that kind of inflames their anger and their frustrations about those kinds of topics to kind of prevent New York City from being and weaken its power. It's fascinating. It's weird, but it was fascinating. I loved this. The message that this book was trying to send, I've heard some people say it was like a little heavy-handed, and I can see that, but I really, really loved it, and I thought the atmosphere of this book was so unique and amazing. Just the eldritch horror mixed with New York City culture was so weird. Like, I just loved this. It was so weird. If any of this sounds appealing to you, or if you've read and liked any of N.K. Jemisin's other things, I encourage you to check this out. It was a weird ride. It was a strange time, but I really enjoyed it. I think it is supposed to be a series. I don't really know how this sets up for more books in a series. This felt pretty contained to me, so I'm curious to see where we go from here. But just as it stands, this was so good. So good. So good. Okay, and the final book I read in the month of September was Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. So technically I think I finished this on October 1st, but we're just gonna pretend that I got it done in September so that I finished all my required books. Cool. So I gave this book 3 stars. Peter Pan is the story of Wendy Darling and her brothers Michael and John as they are kind of swept up and taken to Neverland by Peter Pan, and this kind of follows some of their adventures while they're there. Some of the language was a little strange and hard for me to follow, but I did very much enjoy the whimsical vibe. Peter Pan holds a special place in my heart, but I kind of struggled to get into this one as much as I thought I would. That's a problem I sometimes have with classics, and this was a very classic fairy tale, and it was written kind of in that style. So I had a lot of difficulties connecting with any of the characters, and I think I had trouble connecting with some of the themes as well, but I don't think that was the book's fault. I think that was a little bit of those themes of like family not resonating with me quite as well. But I did really enjoy it. It was pretty quick. I can see why this is such a beloved story, but unfortunately in its like original format, it didn't quite do it as much for me as I had hoped it would, but I still liked it. So overall, 3 stars. But that's all I've got for you guys today. If you've read any of these things and want to chat with me about it, please leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear about it. If you want to keep up with what I'm reading, I have a link to my Goodreads in the description below, but other than that, I'll see you guys next time.